Today we're going to talk about one of the masters of New Thought, which will be an occasional series that we'll do this year, and Emma Hopkins. Emma was known as the teacher of teachers in New Thought. She was originally in Christian Science, and she in fact became sort of the second in command to Mary Baker Eddy for a period of time in that organization. And then they had a falling out, and she went and started her own seminary in Chicago. And during that time that she had her own seminary, she educated a number of the people that founded the New Thought teachings, the various families of New Thought, including the Fillmores that founded Unity and the Brooks sisters that founded Divine Science. Ernest Holmes was never one of her students, but they did have a series of about a dozen conversations very early in his ministry. And she is considered to be one of the great resources in our teaching. She's a mystic. There are about 5 or 6 books of her writings that are out there, including there's also a biography that's recently been published. But she's really an interesting person. She would be what you would call an absolutist, in the sense that there's absolutely only one way to think. There's absolutely only one way to view the essential nature of reality, and if you deviate from that, you suffer. Pretty simple. Okay, so let's look at some of her statements. He said, we start on the path by finding out what your mind is seeking and naming it. Can you name just exactly what your mind is seeking? And then she says, what the whole world is seeking is the good that is theirs. Quite often I find that people that find themselves in a place of confusion or uncertainty, when I talk to them, you know, I'll say, well, what do you want? What are you seeking? And they have a hard time figuring that out. They know what they don't want. You know what you don't want. You don't want what you've got. Or you want it in a different amount, either more or less. But there's not a lot of clarity around what you do want. And it's the mind, the way our mind works is it has to have something to go toward. It has to have something to focus on. It has to have, if you will, kind of a goal idea. That is something I'm working toward. Quite often when we get into the place of what I would call practicing avoidance, where most of our energy is about avoiding something, a negative outcome, for example. And we do this all the time. It's part of our just way of being. You know, we were having a little conversation with a couple people who asked me about the cruise and this morning, and this is like the third time this has come up in conversations about the cruise. Well, I'd love to go on a cruise, but I don't want to get sick. Right? Because we had the news recently of a couple of instances where people on cruise ships got sick. Okay. So in order to avoid getting sick, I'm not going to go on a cruise. Now, that might be a very wise way to think. It might be a lot of wisdom in that, but the problem is when you train yourself to motivate yourself by means of avoiding what you don't want, you spend an inordinate amount of time thinking about what you don't want. And the law of attraction, being what it is, tends to attract in what you think about most of the time. So if you're thinking about what you don't want, you're probably going to get more of it than you would, well, you don't want any of it anyway, right? So are you attracting into your life things and people and events that you don't want? Anyone? Okay. Just John. Okay. So John, let me talk to you. Okay, because no one else needs this, but you know, that Byron Katie stuff makes you honest, right? Yeah. Just think about your past week. From now going back 7 days. You know, you had Sunday and then Monday and then Tuesday and then Wednesday, and just think about how your week went. How often were you upset or agitated or annoyed? How often maybe did you have trouble sleeping because you were trying to figure out how to get around something or avoid something, or you were afraid that something was going to occur that you didn't want to occur? You see, how much of your energy, your psychic energy, goes into being concerned about something you don't want in your life? And I would point out that to the degree that is so, you're not happy. It's hard to be happy when you're thinking about what you don't want. especially if you're thinking, well, I don't want it and I've got it and I can't get rid of it. Or I don't want this to happen, but I don't see any other way to direct my life right now, so it's inevitable that it's going to happen. Hard to be joyful and blissful and light and airy when you're thinking that way, when you're feeling that. It's hard to sleep. See, that's why there's so many sleep meds prescribed in this country. You know, in terms of if you combine sleep medication and antidepressants, there are more prescriptions currently in America than there are people. Now, that it's not because we need those in order to function at a base level. It's because we've thought our way into that kind of a reality where I can't do anything about how I feel or how I think, so give me a pill, and at least I can numb out. See? Now, that's not 100% true. There are people that have chemical imbalances and things like that that have to be dealt with. But I don't think we need that many prescriptions based on our biological, natural expression. What the whole world is seeking is the good that is theirs. What is your good? Emma said, there is good for me and I ought to have it. That was her Joseph Campbell follow your bliss statement. There is good for me and I ought to have it. Everybody say that. There is good for me and I ought to have it. See? What if that was your dominant feeling and statement? Your dominant goal way of thinking, your dominant way of feeding. How, you know, feels good when you say that, right? It's hard to really feel upset or negative when you're saying that, unless while you're saying it, you're thinking, well, I don't have it. I don't really believe this crap. Life sucks and then you die. There's good for me and I ought to have it, then you die. Okay? You're like, yeah, you're going to die. But don't let that stop you from living. See? So there's good for me and I ought to have it. And underlying that is a consciousness, a metaphysical understanding of the universe, of oneness, of cooperation, that as your consciousness evolves and as it accepts something as so, if it is really so, in other words, if it's in alignment with the laws, there is nothing in the universe to keep you from having it, from experiencing it. And that's true if it's positive or negative, right? We know that. We can create a consciousness that draws in all kinds of negativity and fear and all kind of stuff, and we suffer. Or we can create a consciousness that draws in all kinds of joy and all kinds of creative expression and so forth. But I will share with you this. It's pretty obvious, I think, if you pay attention, that the general consciousness out there in the world is largely fear-based. Most people live their lives in fear. They're afraid of, well, whatever is going on. They're afraid they're going to have bad health. They're afraid that the government's out to get them. They're afraid that, you know, fill in the blank. They're afraid that somebody's going to think they're a phony. They're afraid that there's not enough money. They're afraid that the whole system's going to collapse. Or whatever. They're afraid that somebody's going to cut them off on the 405 or go too slow in front of them. There's very few people that are largely motivating themselves with the idea that there's good for me and I ought to have it. You know where you see it quite a bit? You see it in little children. You know, little kids around, like when they get mobile. You know, about 18 months, year to 18 months, they start crawling, you know, and then they get up and they're walking like this, you know. They're always going towards something, aren't they? You know, ooh, gimme, you know, and it might be something that would kill them, you know. They don't know. There's this innate kind of an exuberance for the world. And parenting is largely keeping them from killing themselves through that exuberance, right? No, don't run into the swimming pool. You know. And we have that as part of us, and it seems like it's sort of trained out of us over time in the process of becoming civilized. See, and we get to be adults and we're supposed to be serious. Adults are supposed to be concerned. I'm a concerned adult, people will say. Right? Now, let me share something with you. Concern is like acid. It corrodes. It eats away at your life. Not that kind of acid. Not the orange stuff. Hey, I was almost at Woodstock. It's corrosive. We think it feels responsible to worry about stuff and be concerned about stuff, and am I going to have enough? And is everything going to be okay? Is everybody going to like me? But the problem is the way our psychology works is that becomes harmful to our potential being expressed. Yeah, you can motivate people with fear. It works pretty well, but it only works on a short-term basis. Because there's something within us that pushes back. There's something within us that doesn't like being pushed around. Now, Tony's a guy that doesn't like being pushed around. Tony, come up here a minute, would you? Okay, just put your hand out. Okay, can everybody see? We're just, doing it. Okay. Okay, now, I just leaned into you, so what'd you do?
Resisted.
You resisted. You pushed back. It was just kind of automatic, right? I mean, you didn't have to think about, oh, gee, I think I'll resist. It was sort of, as soon as I pushed, there was a push back, and I could be in trouble here. Okay, but see, what pushed back in Tony was an internal reflexive idea that I don't like to be pushed around. Thank you. You can have a seat. Thank you. You get a home version of our game to take home. But there's this whole idea. But see, the same thing is true psychologically. If somebody starts pushing you around psychologically, internally you resist. It's part of who we are. We have within us a realization of power that we don't often fully realize at the surface level of our being, but it's there. And when you try to push yourself around, you resist. We've talked about this before, when you give yourself a lot of have-tos, there's an inner process that says, I'll get you out of it, even if I have to get you sick. See, a lot of times we get sick to keep from doing something we have to do but don't want to do, or are afraid to do. See? There's good for me and I ought to have it. There's no have in there. Have it except to have it, not have to. See? All that stands between you and your good, she says, which belongs to you and which you ought to have, is your own idea of the absence of good. We've taught, there's not enough stuff to go around, How many were around in the 70s during the oil crisis when we were going to be out of gasoline in about 6 years? I was in the cradle at the time, but I do remember. I vaguely remember. I remember I traded in. I had a Ford, big Ford Crown Vic ex-state police car with a 428-inch engine in it that would just fly. I heard. I never took it up to it. And I traded it in for a used Volkswagen. Because gas had rocketed up to 50 cents a gallon. Because we're going to be out of gas. It's not to say we're never going to be out of gas. It just wasn't then. But see, that kind of event stirs something in us. It stirs a fear of not enough. And then what happens is all of a sudden, then there's not enough of other things. All of a sudden, it becomes normal to have shortage in your life. And the generation before our baby boom generation had the shortages of the recession in World War II. And out of that came a consciousness of never enough, and you had to save everything and reuse it. See? Not because it was necessarily the intelligent thing to do, but because we're afraid if we don't, we won't have anything. All that stands between me and my good, which belongs to me and I ought to have, is my own belief in the absence of that good. Because instead of thinking and feeling there's good for me and I ought to have it, God, I wonder if there's going to be enough. If I don't really work and work and work and work, there won't be enough to go around. I was reading a quote from Buckminster Fuller the other day, and he said, the idea that everyone should have to work for a living is a ridiculous idea. I usually work alone, but you're good, so keep it up. The idea that think about it. We have a culture that sort of overtly and covertly says if you're not being economically productive, you're somehow a drain. And not just people on welfare. What about people that stay-at-home moms? We used to call them housewives. They were, they didn't make any money, so they were just doing what had to be done, while the man did the important work and brought home the bacon, to use the vernacular of my youth. See? But even though there's been some shifts in that the underlying consciousness that says if you're not economically productive, you're a drain, is still there. Even if you don't talk about it, it's there. And people, how often do you get asked, what do you do when you meet someone? That's usually the first, second, maybe the third question in. Where do you live? And he goes, well, depending on the context. But what do you do? Nothing. As little as possible. Nothing economically viable. I borrow money from people I just met. You want to have somebody be quiet next to you on the airplane? But, that's part of it. What do you do? And you're supposed to say something that you do that it has to have some esteem associated with it. I usually tell people I'm a sex therapist when they first meet me on the plane. It either begins or ends the conversation. All that stands between me and my good, which I ought to have, and which belongs to me. It belongs to me. Is my belief in the absence of that good, my belief that it belongs to someone else, my belief that there isn't enough to go around, my belief that I'm not worthy of it, my belief that I'm not effectual or good enough to generate anything important or meaningful. Our good is omnipresent, everywhere present. All the time. That potential I talked about, that inner potential that you are wired into as part of this universe, is limitless, it's infinite, and it's fully present right now. And to the degree we don't accept that, it doesn't show up, and then we're amazed when somebody else does something wonderful. When somebody, I put a thing up on Facebook about, I forget exactly what the context was, but it was, I know what it was. It was a young minister had posted that he was very frustrated that he couldn't start a center and be full-time in ministry because there wasn't enough money and he would have to work another job. And the implication was the organization should do something about that. That Centers for Spiritual Living should have a pot of money to help people start ministries, which would be wonderful. And my response and somebody put right below that, a young woman put, it's the economy, there's not enough money. So I have this technique I use before I respond, I bite the inside of my lip. And if the pain of doing that doesn't stop me from replying, I reply. Because I'm going to say something that might be considered controversial and could even be interpreted in some levels as not kind. You know, and it's not intended to be either one. Well, controversial is okay, not kind. It's just saying, you know, here's my viewpoint. And I gave my example when I went into ministry. And I was a little older, but I quit my job. My ex-wife and I took almost a 6-figure cut in salary from one year to the next. And I said, what's age got to do it? What's the difference? The thing is, are you following your passion? Do you believe your good is there for you? Or do you think your good is coming through the people that come into your center? That it's dependent on them. Your good is dependent on them. Then you're going to be in fear that there's not enough people, that they're not giving enough, that they're not showing up in the right way. It has nothing to do with it. You may be the channel of some of my financial good, but you're not the source. There's only one source. There's only one thing happening here. And if I'm going to worry about whether there's enough and whether, you know, do we have enough people? Look, oh God, there's an empty seat. That could be $20 or $1, depending on who shows up. Or it could be the person that takes $5 out of the basket when it comes around. So that could be a very positive empty seat. Man, if I thought like that, I'd go nuts. I know that because I tried it for a while. I would chase people down the street to see if they were coming back next Sunday. Now you think, well, as a young minister, you ought to know better. You don't know better till you really express it and demonstrate it. We're all learning. My good is omnipresent everywhere all the time. God, our good, is spirit. Spirit is free, untrammeled, unhindered, irresistible here and now. What's in your way? What's stopping you from having the life of your dreams? Yeah, doing something about it maybe, but you know, and I don't want you to beat yourself up about this. This isn't about making yourself wrong for not having it now. It's about recognizing that it's there and it's waiting for you to say yes. It's not easy to say yes when we've been conditioned that yes can cost us. That yes can get you betrayed. That yes can take you into bankruptcy. See? But if you've been in bankruptcy or you've been betrayed and you're still here, that means that was part of your getting to the ultimate yes. It was essential, or it wouldn't have happened. Your good is free, untrammeled, unhindered, irresistible, here and now. That sounds like a yes. I love this because, you know, we don't talk about sin here much, but there is a sin in metaphysics. And the sin, as she says, this is all the sin anybody has ever committed, being mistaken about their nature and living from that mistake. Thinking I'm not enough. That's a sin. A sin in the sense not of moral turpitude, but a sin in the sense of a mistake. You know that sin comes from the archery term to miss the mark. Eric Butterworth, a great unity teacher, said it this way: there is only one sin in the universe, and that's the frustration of potential. And only I can frustrate my own potential. I've done it plenty of times. I know how to do it. I'm probably doing it right now. And so are you. We're always going to do that until we get to the point where when you can completely express your potential without any hindrance, you will cease to be in form. You will become the Buddha, and the Buddha has no form. So until then, you've got some work to do. But look around. So does everybody that's still sitting here. If anybody vaporizes and goes off into the ether, you know they made it. I mean, Andy's done that a few times, but he always comes back. Being mistaken about my nature and living from that mistake. I'm not good enough, I'm not smart enough, I'm not tall enough, I'm not man or woman enough, I'm not whatever. Not true. We've got to live from truth. We've got to refuse to live from anything else. It's said that when you had a session with Emma and you sat down and told her your problem, she would say, "You have told me nothing but lies. You're a liar. Until you learn to be a truth teller, you will suffer. You have no problems. You have only the opportunity to have your good." And if we've been confused along the pathway, our current problems are always the vehicle into the opportunity. That's the other good part. The universe is never against you, no matter how much you've screwed it up. And some of us have screwed it up, let's face it, massively. But you always begin from newness. The potential is never diminished. The moment you feel this truth and speak it, you catch a new breath of health, and your neighbor catches a new breath of health as well. Everything rises to acknowledge truth. Here she gets into the idea of being such an energy force that you affect others without ever having to do anything affirmative to do it. You've probably been in the room with someone where you felt their vibration, and it can be kind of negative or positive. You know, when I'm in the room with the Dalai Lama, which has happened a couple of times, something's going on. I assume it's him. That is so prayed up, that is so full of a loving consciousness that it simply vibrates outward, and we are part of that field. You become part of the dominant field you're in. You become affected by the dominant field around you. Are you being more affected, or are you affecting others? What if you decided to be the dominant field in every room you entered, and you decided to be pure love and refused to be anything else? A field of pure love cannot be defeated by fear. Fear cannot enter. Fear will turn around and walk away. Fear and love cannot exist in the same space. That's pretty cool. Speaking out continuously what we have felt and thought intuitively is the first movement toward demonstration, toward manifestation, toward satisfaction. Speaking out continuously what we have felt and thought intuitively. In other words, your intuition comes from within. Your intuition is always positive. It's always uplifting. It's always loving. If you might get a hunch that's negative. That's not intuition. Intuition comes from the depth of the oneness up through your conscious, subconscious mind into awareness. And to the degree we haven't stifled it, we will notice that it's there. And we either pay attention to it or we don't. And we either act on it or we don't. So, Emma has the 5 affirmations. So we're going to do these. And as you leave today, the ushers are going to give you a copy of the 5 affirmations to take with you. And you might want to use these today. These have no effect on the outcome of the Super Bowl. Let's say this together. My good is my God. My God is my life, truth, love, substance, intelligence, omnipresent, omnipotent, omniscient. Number 2, I live and move and have my being in God. Number 3, I am spirit, mind, identical with God, wisdom, strength, wholeness. Number 4, God works through me to will and do whatever is my fulfillment to be and do. Whoops. And number 5, I am governed by God the good, and so cannot sin, or can I fear sin, sickness, or death. Now that's a pretty strong consciousness she's pointing out there. And what I would suggest is to sit down quietly sometime this week maybe sooner the better, and work through these affirmations. And as you say them, see what your inner response is. Because if you've been dwelling in a different energy, that energy will make itself known. You know, when you speak a new truth into the universe, anything unlike it within you comes to the surface. So you'll know right away if that feels authentic to you or not. And if it doesn't, I would suggest you take a look at what you've been feeling and say, is that what I would choose to feel? And by the way, for those on live stream, if you would like to get a copy of these, just email us through the website and we'll take care of that for you. She says to expect good and to be very definite in the mind that it is coming. Let me do that again. To expect good and be very definite in the mind, in your mind, that it is coming, is to see it coming. Expect to see it work quickly. Truth is not slow. Truth is quick. With truth, all is now. So, procrastinators, get ready. Here it comes. So Emma's teaching was primarily about this realization that there's only one truth, and our mind should be entertaining that truth on an ongoing basis, more and more powerfully every day. Refuse to be knocked off center. Refuse to allow other people to knock you off center. Stop giving that permission. If you're surrounded by jerks, let them be whoever they are, but don't be affected by them. And the only reason they're jerks is because people like you have been letting them be. Have that invisible love energy that will affect them, because they'll realize their jerkiness isn't working on you anymore, and they'll look at themselves. When you tell them they're a jerk, they will simply resist. When you subtly emanate the energy, it gets past the defenses. It's sneaky. So be sneaky good. Be sneaky love. Work behind the scenes. That's where everything's happening. What's on stage is only a projection of what's happening behind the scenes. Your work is behind the scenes in your own consciousness. Your work is to affirm, to bless, to know, and to love. And so is mine. Thank you. And so it is. Thank you.